Hi, welcome to our webinar this month on top 10 things to know about email, managing Outlook and other email during the eDiscovery process. I'm Gene Albert. Before I introduce Carson, let me just tell you a little bit about Lexby. We're an Austin-based eDiscovery software and services provider, do cloud-based do-it-yourself eDiscovery processing and document review, ESI processing, and we do eDiscovery specialists and consulting. If there's anything we can help with, please give us a call. As part of the webinar, we will provide all registrants with a downloadable version that will include a PDF deck, the MP3 podcast, and a streaming video. We'll have that within a day or two after the webinar. If you have any trouble on following us, please email us at webinars@lexby.com and we'll see what we can do to get it fixed. For future notices of this, the best way is to follow us on LinkedIn at the Lexby company page, and you'll get the first notices of these webinars as they come up. Mentioned if you have any technical issues, we have webinars@lexby.com. Let me introduce Carson. Carson's our founder and CTO here at Lexby. He's an eDiscovery consultant and expert, and he's been the architect on developing our software and our service protocols. He has prior experience in different software ventures and and expert consulting. He has his MBA from the University of Texas and his Master's of Science in Engineering from the Danish Technical University. So with that, I will turn things over to Carsten.
Well, thank you, Gene, and welcome to this month's webinar about emails. We'll be covering the following 10 items. First, a look historically at how fast email volumes have grown, and then start to dive into just the sheer number of different places that emails can be found, which is very important for the discovery phase. Then take a look at the headers of the email, which includes how you can spoof those. And then we're going to go into more details on the time zone and what should be done when you're dealing with cases that span multiple time zones. We're also going to spend a fair amount of time on the deduplication, how you can use that to reduce the amount of emails that need to be reviewed, and of which I see NearDup is somewhat of an extension of that. And finally, we're going to talk about different strategies for increasing the speed of the review. Last item is then how to produce the emails once you're done with the review. So let's start with the background. First email was all the way back in 1971. Since then, email has grown rapidly, and as many or most of the people listening to this webinar are aware, you're probably sending more emails than you're sending regular mail or snail mail, as it's known these days. And if you look at the historic number of physical mail, snail mail versus email, you can see just a tremendous growth in the email. And I think if we look here, we're talking around 1996, thereabout, is when the number of emails matched the number of physical mail. And then the number of physical mail has actually started declining, whereas the number of email just keeps growing and growing. And right now we're at 500 trillion, which is what half, that's the projection. So that's half a quadrillion, and then we're going to get into the quintillions after that. So truly astoundingly big numbers. Emails are a big part of the workday, and as I say that, I will say more and more we're also going to look at not just getting emails, but also getting social media sites, and LinkedIn and other Skype and other sources are going to be very important for eDiscovery. But this one here, we're focusing on email. That is still the #1 source And there are many cases that have evolved around email. And there's one example here from the, if you remember back to 2012 with the Pentagon sex scandal. There's also an email probe going on right now, as you know, with the related to the presidential election. And so it continues to be just an absolute critical part of our work and communication. So where can emails be found? It can really be found in a lot of different places. And it can be, as you see here, it used to be dominated by the servers like Novellus Groupware, still Microsoft Exchange, but more and more you're also seeing it go to be webmails like Gmail and Yahoo and a lot of others. That said, 65% of emails are still stored in Microsoft Exchange. That really is the dominant one. And because of that, because of its historic dominance, a lot of the other email systems are required or allow you to convert things into a PST file. The PST file is the container file that has all the emails, and that is on your local hard drive. If you have a local Outlook set up, you'll have a PST file, and that one will then contain all of the individual emails, which are of type .msg. And each MSG file is an email complete with its body, along with any attachment and its corresponding metadata. If we look at that in more detail, I mean, the places really include the hosted servers, then such as the Outlook. It's the cloud-based servers. It's locally on your hard drive, but it can also be on your firm's computer. It could be in the archive. It could be more and more on the portable devices. So it lives in all these different places, and it's practically impossible to get rid of an email once it has been created and sent. For example, if you take an email and you delete it, then within Outlook, for example, it's just moving it to the trash can. It's still very much there. You can just click on deleted items and it will show up still. So those are your deleted items, which means they really aren't deleted at all. It's basically trying to get rid of the email. As I said, once it's sent, it's practically impossible. Then you could right-click on this, and you could now delete it by emptying the deleted folder. And they now go into a state that's known as deleted emails. But all that has happened behind the scenes is within the PST file. They have now been marked as this part of the file has been deleted, and you can override it. You can reuse this part in the future. But right away, that part isn't reused, and therefore a deleted email is still available. And then even if you go in and you delete the PST, again, that's just now the next level up in the file system. That file is marked as the space has been deleted. It's available for reuse, but it's actually still there on the system, and it could be recovered forensically. And you can just keep going on and on. The cost goes up exponentially each time in terms of recovering it, but it's often there. And if it's not on your computer, it's probably on a backup somewhere. And since it's an email that went from often one location geographic to another, it will have gone through multiple servers, and it may be on those servers, it may be on backups on those servers. So, which leads to the statement that once an email has been sent, it will likely live on in some format indefinitely. It will be on somebody's computer or server or backup tape or something somewhere. It all depends on the cost of recovering it. So let's look inside of one specific email and we're used to seeing the standard fields, the to and the from and the subject. That's how it's presented in the GUI, and that's what we call the visible part. If you open up the file forensically, you will see that it actually contains additional information to what's shown in the GUI, and that will be things such as the IP address of the sender receiver, the things that you can get in these properties, for example. And it's important to then have a forensic system that can take all those fields and then move them into your review system. So you grab these fields, they get fielded into the database when you're reviewing, and that allows you to go in and apply a filter, for example, and say, I only want to see the emails that are from Johnson Adam, for example. And you're not left with, you're now left with just those emails. So that's really important to get these fields or this piece of information fielded so that you can filter on them. And then you can further, search within all of the email body and the attachments. One thing to be aware of is just how easy it can be to make the visible part and the invisible part be out of sync. And therefore, you can actually create an email fairly easily that will show up as being sent from one place, in this case the FBI, but then when you look at the internal data, you can see that it's actually received from a completely different email address. That's the one with the red box around it. And so that's called email spoofing. And if you suspect that some of the emails are fraudulent, there's a fairly easy way to look at those properties and make sure they really are sent from that person. I mean, we've seen cases where all of a sudden there's a critical document introduced at the last minute, and it shows exactly the missing piece of information, but then it was actually it was completely handcrafted, and you can find that out through these properties. Again, the cost goes up, but depending on the case, that could be very worthwhile. Okay, so that brings us to the time zone, which is a very interesting subject, and it could be a topic all of its own. Basically, it sounds really simple, what could be the problem with the time zone, but then the more you look into it, the more wrinkles there are. So for example, if you keep track of when an email was sent, then the Outlook format is just carrying exactly what was the time in Universal Time, which is Greenwich Mean Time. So you have this Universal Time, and it's an offset corresponding to Greenwich, and then the local offset is just applied as you open the email. So for example, if you have your computer and you open up the email and say this was sent at 1 p.m. in Central Time, you take your computer, you travel to California, and you open up that exact same email, your machine adjusts to California, Pacific Time, and now it's saying that exact same email, instead of being sent at 1 p.m. is now showing up as sent at 11 a.m. So what's going on? It's simply that the sent time showing up reflects your local time zone. And in addition to that local time zone, it also reflects daylight savings. So you will have an offset there depending on whether daylight savings is observed and whether it's now summer or winter. Then when you convert these emails into a PDF or you convert them into a TIFF, you're now taking what is dynamic, what is changing depending on the local time zone, and you're making it static. You're freezing this offset and you're printing it onto the PDF. And clearly the PDF will not change if you move from Texas to California. The PDF isn't going to change the time that's printed on it, which means you'll get different results whether you print the email in Texas or you print the email in California. So how do you work with that in litigation? You simply have to decide on a time zone for your emails. And that time zone could then be specific to a custodian. So let's say you have a single custodian in your case, and that custodian was in New York. You just decide that's the time zone we're going to use, and you process all the emails accordingly to that. Not a problem. If you go and you have two different custodians, then you could have two different time zone, one for each. And that still works. But then as the cases gets more and more complicated and you have more and more people and they're traveling around, what we have found is really that the best thing to do is to just move everything to universal time. And because if you take a time zone and it's specific to an individual, you can make it work for emails. But then what happens as soon as you pull in some native files along with it? Here's some Word documents. They will have a date last modified. They'll have a date last created, but that's local to where they were created. And that may not line up with your emails if you're taking all this effort to try and adjust the time zone for the email. And then once you have the native files, that's one complication. Then further complication would be you get a box of paper documents you scan. And what's the time now on those? Well, that depends on where those papers were printed. And so it really becomes difficult to sync multiple people across different time zones with native files from different time zones with printed paper that's being scanned. And what you really would like is for something to line up, so when you're reviewing it and you see this email was sent at 11 o'clock, what happened at 11:05? And we found that for cases with more than one custodian in different time zones, going to UT, Universal Time, is really probably the best solution. If you have a single custodian, you might want to stay in local time. Going to UT in every single case is okay, but it adds the complication that emails in the US that was sent in the evening is now going to show up as being on the next day if it's processed to UT. So you got to be careful there and make sure that whenever you set a date filter that you take that offset into account. But bottom line is, if you have more than one custodian, more than one time zone to deal with, we would recommend the universal time. So now let's start talking about deduplication and what constitute a duplicate. So what happens often is that you have multiple devices with your email on it. So say you have an email on your smartphone, you have an email on your laptop, you have an email on your website, and if those are collected independently and you have an email from a backup, you have an email, you can have your email in 3, 4, 5 different locations. And you're now collecting that in order to make it be part of a case. And now that email will show up multiple times in the system, and it is the identical email. And so it's purely a result of the collection method that it would show up multiple times. And you would like to be able to get rid of that. What I'm talking about there is what we would called the exact duplicates. They are identical. Whereas NearDup means they're close enough. They are like two different revisions of the same agreement, for example. So let's see. We're going to talk about those two types. We're going to talk about the hash values and the vertical dedupe. So this is the overview slide. So let's go in and talk about the hash value first. So there are there are really two different categories. One is the emails, and then the other one is the non-emails, the native files. And for a native file, what you can do is you can generate a hash value of the whole file. So some files are short, some files are long. And let's suppose you want to compare two files and see if they are identical. You could start by saying, are they the same length on disk? I mean, do they take up the same number of bytes? If they're not the same number of bytes, you're done, they're not the same. But if they are the same number of bytes, that does not guarantee that it is the exact same file. I mean, it raises the likelihood, but there's no guarantee. And so how do you compare that they're the same? You really have to compare, piece by piece by piece inside the file, that all of them are the same. You can't just open it and say, oh, they look the same. I mean, you really have to go down at the binary level on disk and compare piece by piece and see that they're the same. And instead of doing that for every single file, you can create effectively like a fingerprint, and it's known as a hash value for that file. And it reduces the length. So if you have enormously long files, they can still be reduced down to this short number. There's one example there of an MD5. So this number right there globally uniquely identifies a file that was created somewhere. And if two files have that same number, then mathematically we can go ahead and say, yes, they are the same file, and we can get rid of one of them. And how do you get rid of a file? There are really two different ways. You could delete it out of the case, and now it's gone, or you can just mark it and saying this is a duplicate. So if you have two files, for example, you would call one of them the prime. That's the one you're going to keep, and then mark the other one as a duplicate. And that duplicate should, in most cases, I think it should be marked as a duplicate. Whether you delete it, that's really up to you. But a lot of people, you see, they'll mark it, they'll suppress it, they'll do the review without it, and then they have it in case they need it later. Emails are a little bit different in that we can't use a hash value to determine if they're the same. And the reason being is, if you take Outlook, for example, which is the example we're using in this presentation, and you save it multiple times. So say you open up one email and you go into Outlook and you say save as, and you create one copy, and then you say save as and you create a second copy, and you do save as and you create a third copy. Now you have 3 files on disk from the identical email. However, if you were to do this fingerprinting, if you were to compare these at the low level, you would see that they are not matching up, even though they came from the exact same email. So what's going on? And if you open them, they'll look the same. You can't tell. What's going on is that Outlook, as it saves it, it injects into the file the date that it last saved and the date and time. And so every time you're saving it, you get a slightly different timestamp inside it. And since it's slightly different inside, it will not match the other file. And they will forensically be 2 different files. So instead, for emails, in order to deduplicate the emails, we'll have to use the metadata to determine if 2 emails are the same. And the metadata would be such as Are these the same emails? Yes, they are the same if they're from the same sender, if they have the same subject, if they have the same date sent. If all of those different metadatas line up, then we can say with very high confidence that yes, this is the same email. There's some emails that are missing some of these fields, like there could be an email with no subject. There are even emails where they're semi-damaged and it has no date sent, and or no sender. And if it's missing some of that data, then we just deem it's not qualified to be part of a dedupe. It doesn't have enough information to generate a high enough confidence. So within, I think it's important to say for emails that emails really go together as an email family. And by an email family, we mean the email plus its attachments. So let's take an example where you have an email and it's got one lease agreement as the attachment. This lease agreement could exist in somewhere else in the system and be the exact same, the duplicate. In this case, we do not want to delete it as a duplicate, because if we do, then you could end up, say you have multiple emails with that same lease agreement, you could end up deleting it as an attachment. And while that's technically, it's okay, the lease agreement is still there somewhere, you're now left with an email that says it has an attachment, but then when you go looking for it, it doesn't have it. So if you have multiple emails with the lease agreement, you don't want to delete these duplicates that are within each email family, because as I said, you would end up with having email that says, I have this attachment, and then when you go to look for it, it's not going to be there. And it's just, you're going to think something is wrong with how the case was processed. You're going to spend up more time looking for these quote-unquote missing attachments than if you left them in. Instead, a better system would be to be able to mark them and then as NearDup or SacDup, and then you can suppress them, but they're still they're there as you're reviewing them. So within the emails, we are only deduping an email if the entire email and its attachment are identical. And within the non-emails, the native files, we're deduping based on a hash value. The emails are based on metadata dedupe, and the native files are based on the hash. We're not deduping between the native files and an email attachments. But what happens in the case where you have, say, 10 different people, and then you go and you remove duplicates, and then later, and you keep one of them as a prime and you delete the other 9. And then later, the one you kept happened to be for custodian Sue, and later Sue is no longer part of the lawsuit. So Sue gets dropped as a custodian. What happens then? You have just taken your 10 identical documents or emails, you removed 9 of them, you only left 1, and you left it with custodian Sue, and now you're removing custodian Sue. So now you would have to identify that Sue contained a prime, and that you are basically needing to locate that prime and take back and put it into a different custodian. That process is very difficult to do after the fact. And it's difficult to the point that that it's considered best practice to then do what's known as a vertical dedupe. And by vertical dedupe, it means that we're only removing duplicates that are within each custodian. So Let's suppose that you got Bob and you got Sue as custodian 1 and 2. You find 3 documents, as you can see in the first example, the 3 green ones, but we're only going to mark the second one in custodian 1 as a duplicate and remove that one. So when we're done, we're left with 2 green documents, one for custodian 1 and one for custodian 2. And then these custodians can then come and go. We can drop some of them. We can keep adding new ones, and we don't have a problem at all about accidentally being left without the document completely. So that vertical dedupe guards against that and is considered best practice. The alternative is known as horizontal dedupe, and in that case you would take all 3 green documents and you'd keep only one of them. And let's suppose you only kept the one with custodian 2, drop both of them in custodian 1, and then custodian 2 leaves the case, and now you're left with a scenario that you don't want, which is very difficult to figure out, that you need to put one of the green documents back into custodian 1. So that really that sums it up for dedupe and the exact dupe, which is exact documents. We use the hash for the native files. We use the metadata for the emails. We keep the email families together, and we recommend doing the vertical dedupe. So the extension to that exact dupe is then to talk about NearDup. And what is NearDup? It's 2 documents that forensically are not the same, like the example I gave with saving out an Outlook email message 3 times in a row. So it could look identical, or it could just look very similar, but forensically it's not a dedupe, and instead we would refer to that as a NearDup. The algorithm for doing this is quite complex. You effectively have to in principle, you have to compare every document or the content of every document against every other document. You have to find smarter ways to implement it, or it would take years to run in a large case. But in principle, it's comparing the content, the text content of any document against any other document. And then if those are found to be substantially the same, they will be put into the same group. And in the graphics here, you'll see how we have unstructured documents, and then you can run the NearDup detection, and you'll end up with a NearDup grouping. What does NearDup grouping buy you? It buys you a couple of things, but one of them is that you'll be able to go into a system and you will detect groups. Like this case here, I see that it has detected 3,758 groups. So of 2 or more documents. The largest ones look like it's group 62, and it has 92 documents in it. We've seen examples where the groups themselves can have 5,000 or more documents. It all depends on the case, and therefore the power of NearDup to a large extent will depend on the case. But you will be able to open up one of the groups like this one here. This has 17 documents in it, and you'll see that they are substantially the same subject. So by grouping the documents, if you're planning to do a linear review as opposed to a keyword search, if you're doing any kind of linear review, this would be very powerful in terms of putting the similar or like documents into being reviewed at the same time. So in the example we've seen with a group that was 5,000 documents, they were all some kind of nightly log file being generated by the system. They were not responsive to the case. A user could open that up, make that determination within a minute, and see that they're all the same, and then code them all the same as being not responsive, and now that person was going at 5,000 documents per minute. So very powerful compared to the usual, 100 documents per hour or so. And so for linear review, that's critical. It also is very powerful for the privilege log. So if you have found, say, 18 documents that are all privileged and they're all related to an agreement, you can now use the NearDup to see, for these 18, are they, did I find all of them? Or are there maybe 20 of them and there are 2 of them that are either the same or they're just revisions, and you didn't find those by just brute force looking at all the documents. This will help you pull those out and and prevent you from waiving privilege by having some of the versions not marked correctly. Okay, so let's look at the metadata and email families in general and why they speed up review. And this is really, why do you need a review tool? If you just open up the emails, I mean, you can take them all, you can save them to disk, and you can start opening them up one at a time and reviewing it that way, straight from your hard drive. But it really will, in the end of the day, take a lot longer. It will just not be as effective as if you are able to put it into a review system where you can extract all of the metadata, like we say here, sender, receiver, date, time, subject, and then put it into a review system. Once it's in there, we'll take the fields and you will be able to go in and say, okay, I only want to see things that happened in this specific time. So you can put in a date time filter on it. You can put in a filter on, I only want to see things from this sender or this recipient, this particular location where it came from, of this type. So you're really able to narrow it down to for very specific things you're looking for. It also will be fully searchable. We'll touch about that in the next section. But for now, really the ability to put it in there and go and filter down to the ones that you want to look at just speeds up the review. And it goes back to how you can find things that are similar of nature. And anytime it's similar, you'll be speeding up the review significantly. This is an example of how the email and the attachments are kept together in the viewer, and that you can easily go from the email body to its attachment and back again. Here we're showing how if you find an email and it's privileged, you can have an auto-propagating of the coding, which means that it will go ahead and mark the whole email family as being either privileged or the whole email family is responsive. You're not going to break that apart and do a partial production of the email. You really want to produce the email along with all of its attachments. And the system will then automatically let you mark all of them consistently for, say, responsive. You can also do a mass coding and update all of them to be, in this example here, I'll update all 25 at once to be privileged. And then if you're using a review system and you have gone through and you mark things responsive and privileged, then when it's time to do a production, that will be a whole lot easier, and things such as a privilege lock will be auto-generated based on your previous coding, and then you can just go in and review that and make sure that everything is to your liking. So that's another thing that makes it more consistent and significantly speeds up that part. We talked a little bit about searching when it's in a system, there's one thing that that is really important, and that is emails will come in and they will be searchable by their nature in terms of the body of themselves. I mean, that will be, if it's an MSG or an EML or some other form, you will be able to take that text and search for it and find it. But quite often, emails will have attachments that are not searchable, and it could be a fax of a contract, for example, and you're just getting that TIFF image of it, or it could even be a PDF that doesn't have anything but an image in it. And let me just digress quickly and say there really are 3 types of PDFs out there that come in as attachments. Some of them are generated natively, and they're like any other Word document. They're fully searchable. They've got the fonts. You can zoom in all the way, and it doesn't matter how much you zoom in. It's all crisp. It's text-based. And then you got your PDFs that are image-based, and they're not searchable. You'll get that little crosshair instead of getting the drag select. And if you zoom in, it'll get all grainy. So those are not searchable. And then there's the third category, which is a combination of the two. It's image-based, but it has run through optical character recognition, the OCR, and it has done the best attempt at recreating the text from the image. Not as good quality as if you're starting out with the native, but at least it is searchable. And if you zoom in, it'll still be grainy, but you can now drag select and get that text. However, that OCR does not happen automatically on your incoming emails. If you just have the email themselves, then and you search for this critical piece of information that might be in an image-based PDF, it's just nowhere to be found. It will not show up. And so how do you make sure that you get into a system that will allow you to find everything? And you do that by going through processing. And that's why you need processing, otherwise it will not be searchable. Here's an example. This table is showing the same thing, that if it is imaged based, then there will be no text unless it's been OCR'd, and then vice versa. If it's a native one, then yeah, we already have the text. So in order to get the best of both worlds, what we actually do in our platform is index the native as it comes in, OCR anything that's an image-based PDF or a TIFF, get all that text, and then combine the two to where when you go in to do a search, it's completely seamless. It will look in both categories, in both buckets, and it will find the text on that agreement, even if it was image-based to begin with. Here's an example where we're searching for something, and then it will find it in the document, even if it was image-based to begin with. That brings us to our last point, which is really how to then take the email and produce it once you're done reviewing it and you mark things responsive. One thing to watch out for with emails is that, let's suppose you have an attachment and you have found that attachment needs to be redacted. So you go ahead, you redact the document, and now you feel confident that this has been redacted. It will not produce the unredacted version of that attachment. And that is correct. But you have to be wary that if emails are involved, if this was an attachment, if you don't watch out, the email itself, the MSG, could be produced in native form. And if it was, it would now spoil your redaction, because you could open up that original email, double click on the attachment, and there it is in its unredacted form. So you got to be super careful that you're not dealing with an email attachment when you have certain privilege or redaction in play. And then by the same token, that MSG could have been coming from a zip file. And so now it's not enough to make sure that the MSG, the email, isn't there. You also have to make sure that that zip file wasn't there. Or maybe it came from a PST file. And any other kind of container file, you have to make sure all the way up, track it back, and see that these higher up container files are not produced, because they would simply allow the other side to click in and find the unredacted version. And so you have to make sure that you're in a review platform that will do all that bookkeeping for you. And so if you redact a document, it will automatically keep track of that whole chain of dependencies, parent-child relationships, and make sure that none of the natives are produced if one of the children contains redacted information. You also have to look at the production types, and there are basically we're seeing native productions where all the files are produced natively. We're seeing TIFF productions, which mainly came from the old concordance and summation review software. Has been around for a long time, are still very prevalent, and then we're seeing PDF production. So often you see some combination of TIFF plus natives or PDF production plus natives. The TIFF production takes everything into black and white TIFF group for compression, generally speaking. And so even though it's taken down to black and white and compressed, you lose a fair amount of fidelity. You also lose color. But even though it's that compressed, we often see it being 5 to 10 times bigger than just the native documents themselves, because every single page has been turned into an image. And so if you have, for example, one document that just says ABC, I mean, that text document takes up no space. But then if you create an image of a document that says ABC, that image can be quite large. And so that expansion factor makes TIFF productions quite large, and therefore often quite expensive, both for storage and also just moving it around and handling it. So something to be careful about and be aware is you may not have to do a TIFF production, or you can negotiate that, and just bear in mind that it could end up being costly. And then I would say last but not least on this one is, why not just do everything natively? I mean, why take things to TIFF or PDF? And that is, if you just have a native document, imagine you open up an Excel sheet and it's large. There is no good way to bait stamp that. There is no way to put a bait stamp in an Excel sheet. Whereas if you print it you print any document to a PDF, for example, now you can put a bait stamp in the corner, and you're able to refer to exactly this document. So it could have the bait stamp, it could have the exhibit number stamped on there, and you're able to work with it much more effectively than if you kept everything as a native production. And with that, that wraps up the 10 things to know about email. And I appreciate you attending this webinar.
Great. Well, thanks, Carsten. That is very informative and comprehensive. I'm sure everybody's going to love that. We will have a streaming version of this, as I mentioned, in a PDF version of the slide deck, and also a MP3 for you to look at. We'll send that out within a day or so after this. We also have a short survey immediately after the webinar for those of you looking at it live, and please consider filling that out for us. We really look at this and value all the input on how we do these webinars, and also on there to ask what you'd like for future topics, and we'd be happy to take that into consideration and get that into the queue to make sure we are covering everything that everybody wants. And thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Bye.